Okay, welcome to Psych 236. We are talking about, we're on chapter 16. We're talking about adolescence and we're talking about psychosocial development. We've covered the first half of that, and today we're going over the second half. And today we're going to talk about sex, okay, adolescence and communication about sex and other things related to sex. And we'll also talk about drugs and, psychological problems. So there's going to be a lot of information. Okay, so let's talk about communication about sex. Okay, so you have these teenagers, right? Adolescents, and there needs to be some communication about this. Okay, if you don't talk to your teens about sex, by this time, well, they're going to get the information one way or another. So it might as well be from you as a parent. Okay, so communicating about sex. So parent-child communication, trust, and closeness all predict less sexual activity and safer sex. If you talk about them, you've talked about sex with them, okay, and you have a trusting relationship, you have a close relationship, your kids are actually, adolescents are less likely to have sex, okay, and when they do have sex, they're more likely to have safe sex, and they're more likely to tell you about it, right, if you have that closeness. And that's what you want. You want to have that closeness so they keep you in the loop. They tell you what's going on. Or you can give them advice, you can tell them about what to expect, and they're less likely to just have sex, right? And have this casual sex or sex for pleasure, whatever you want to call it, and they're more likely to take it seriously. There's higher rates of teen sex in single parent families, okay? And, I believe things about that come up, but yeah, there's because, well, there's less closeness. There's a parent that's missing, and there could be frustration, other difficulties. And for many reasons, there's higher rates of teen sex. Teens are more likely to have sex if they come from single parent families. Communication, okay, communication about sex that stresses only pregnancy and disease, right? When you only tell them about the fact that they can get pregnant and it's going to ruin their lives, and that they get a disease. If that's all you tell them about sex, that's actually sends a mixed message, right? It's like you're telling them that it's okay for them to have sex as long as they're protected, right? So they don't get those STDs or those STIs, or so they don't get pregnant. You send them a mixed message. You need to tell them other things about sex too. You need to tell them that sex is also something that has to do with, with relationships. People who love each other, with marriages, to do with raising kids, right? With family. You have to stress the social, emotional, familial, and moral consequences of sexual activity. It's not just about biology. It's not just about pregnancy and disease, right? If that's all you tell them, then, they get the message that it's okay for them to have sex as long as they're protected. But it's related to everything. Sex is related to everything. And you have to tell them about those other things, right? About love, about family, about the moral consequences, the social consequences. You need to tell them that something that, two people do when they love each other and they plan on getting married. Depending on how conservative you are, you might even tell them that it's something that people do after they get married. Good luck keeping them from having sex before they get married, though. Most people can't wait that long. But you need to tell them something about it. If you don't tell them and are open about your teens, about sex, then they're going to get their information somewhere else, and it could be very bad information. Okay, they could get information about sex also from schools. About 93% of schools actually teach adolescents something about sex, but it mostly has to do with health. Okay, with health issues and disease and things like that. Remember, sex education I had in school was mainly just about diseases. Okay, and even the stuff about pregnancy, they didn't really say much about that. Okay, but it's mostly about health and disease. Schools focus mostly on the dangers of sex and the benefits of abstinence. You shouldn't do it, right? You're going to get a disease, right? If you do that kind of things. And these abstinence-only programs that just stress, that you shouldn't do it, that it's dangerous, that it's bad, right? They actually have no effect on teen on rates of teen sex. Half of 16-year-olds still had sex, even though they told them to be abstinence, right? They stressed that, right? The number of partners that they had, whether they used contraception or that, all that unchanged. It had no effect when you just teach them about abstinence. In other words, don't do it, right? Don't do it. You're going to get into problems. Just don't do it, right? That's not a good message. Okay, it has no effect. Okay, you need to tell them more than that. Okay, 43% of schools also teach something about correct condom use, right? They say something about that. There was no such education when I was going to school. They didn't say anything about contraception, because a lot of people worry that if you teach them about contraception, that it basically you're telling them, oh, you can have sex as long as you use contraception. So less than half of the schools will say something about even condoms, right? Teachers are even less likely to talk about contraception in general, okay? Like being on the pill or the shot, whatever you want to call it, right? They're less likely to talk about that. They're more likely to tell you about the health aspects of that. But it's very important that you learn about those other things as well. And schools are reluctant to do that often, okay? It depends on the school, okay? It also depends on parents, what parents, what they tell the schools and what they want, okay? Teaching adolescents about contraception does not increase sexual activity, right? Unlike what people fear, telling kids about contraception, right? What they can do so they don't get pregnant or they don't become a father, right? Telling them about that sort of stuff doesn't increase the frequency of sex or their number of partners. It doesn't increase sexual activity. But parents fear that it will, and therefore they don't want the teachers talking about that stuff. And sometimes teens will report back to their parents, they said this at school, and like, what? They did that? And they go and complain, right? Sex education from the media, very bad, okay? The internet is a common source of sex information. Guess what kind of information they're gonna get, right? They're gonna get stuff that's really way too extreme. There's gonna be all sorts of misinformation. How they're gonna learn about sex from the media? Pornography. That's what they're gonna learn, okay? That's what they're gonna learn from. And they're gonna basically have these ideas that sex is something you're supposed to just do for pleasure, and that guys are supposed to have these huge penises, right? And the girls are just supposed to enjoy it and do it all the time. And it's just a lot of misinformation. You're supposed to do all this kinky, freaky stuff. Most people don't do that stuff, okay? There's a lot of misinformation there. Hopefully that's not where kids are learning. Your kids are gonna learn about sex. You need to tell them about it yourself, okay? There's a lot of misinformation in the media. There's a controversial correlation between exposure to media sex and adolescent sexual initiation. There's research that says that the more they watch that stuff on the internet, the more likely they are to have sex and even engage in unsafe sex. And in the media, it's mostly unsafe sex, and do things that are just extreme or weird or have very permissive attitudes about sex. You're not getting very good messages, okay, from the internet, from even TV about sex. Sex is like something that's very casual, and it's supposed to be something that's just for enjoyment, and there's rough sex and there's all kinds of kinky stuff, right? That's not what you want your kids to be learning. They're not ready for that stuff, and they think that that's normal, and it's not normal, okay? Information from parents. Many parents wait too long to talk to their kids about sex. They wait too long. They wait until their kids are already like, adolescents, 15, 16, 17 years of age. And then you want to talk to them about it. It's already too late. And then they'll tell you, Mom, Dad, I already know. All right, you don't need to tell me, right? And they avoid specifics. They mention it maybe, if at all, and they'll leave out the part that is actually the sexual activity. They'll just tell you about getting pregnant, or they'll tell you about diseases and stuff like that too. And they'll leave out the part about sex. Yeah, they don't want to show you any images or any pictures or videos. But that is what actual sex is. I'm not saying that you should show your kids that, but you need to tell them about it, okay? And what it actually involves, okay? Not saying in any crude way or any explicit way either, okay? So many parents wait too long, they avoid specifics, and are uninformed about the adolescents' relationships. By the time they talk to them about it, their kids are already having sex, or they're already in relationships. They don't even know what's going on. Mostly what parents tell you when it comes to talking about sex is like, yeah, there's this thing called sex. Don't do it, or you're gonna get in trouble. I'm gonna beat your ass if you do, or you're gonna get in trouble, or whatever it is, you're gonna get pregnant, and that's basically all they tell you. They really don't want to talk to you about it. It's embarrassing. It's very it's a touchy subject. It's very personal. So they mostly want to avoid the subject. Only about 25% of adolescents receive any education, any sex education from their parents. About a fourth of them only had any sex education from their parents. Most of the parents are not going to say anything about it. And when they do, they don't say very much. Warm, open communication is effective. You need to tell them, what it is and, about what to expect and all stuff. And not just the biological stuff, but also the stuff that's emotional, that's psychological, all that other stuff. Sex is a very complicated thing. We shouldn't think of it as just biological. And it's a problem. And if parents don't really educate their kids about sex, who should be educating kids about sex? Maybe schools, but then parents get mad. No, I don't want schools teaching my kids about that stuff either. Right? Well, they're going to get the information from somewhere. From peers. What do they learn from peers? Adolescents, sexual behavior is strongly influenced by their peers, especially when parents are silent, forbidding, or vague. Right? When you as a parent don't want to tell them anything, guess what? They're going to learn about it from their peers. Right? Their friends or other people they know. They're going to show them pictures, videos, whatever it is. They're going to tell them stuff about it. And a lot of it is going to be kind of extreme information. The stuff that has to do with pornography. That's what they're going to learn about. That's what they're going to hear about. Right? But that's what happens when parents are silent, when they don't say anything, or parents just forbid it and they don't really tell you much about it, or they're vague. Oh yeah, there's this thing called sex and stuff. Yeah, that's where kids come from. Don't do it, right? That kind of stuff. They're kind of vague about it. They're going to learn about it, and they're going to learn about it from their peers if you don't tell them about it. They might as well know stuff about it, so when they do hear about it from their peers, they can correct their peers and basically tell them, no, that's not really what it's about. Like, oh no, that's just extreme stuff. It's not really like that at all, right? But the stuff they're going to learn from their peers is the stuff their peers learn from the internet, if they haven't learned about it themselves already from the internet already. Only about half of US adolescents discuss anything like pregnancy or STIs, right? And many are unable to come to a shared conclusion based on accurate information. Those that are couples, only about half of them actually talk about the dangers of getting some disease, some infection or something, let alone protecting themselves, right? Or about the possibility of pregnancy. You have to be responsible. Even if you are an adolescent and you are engaged in that, you have to go about it responsibly. You have to be protected. You have to have a plan just in case things happen, right? That's important. And it's important, by the way, that adolescents can make these choices without necessarily informing their parents, because they need to have access to contraception and birth control, things like that, without having to tell their parents. Now, in some states, adolescents have to tell their parents, or the parents have to give permission for them to receive contraception. I don't think that's the case in California. This is a health issue, and a lot of adolescents are not close to their parents. They're not going to tell their parents, and if they get parental permission, they're not going to use it. They're not going to get it. So it's a health issue. They need access to this, right? Even the ones that don't have good relationship with their parents, they need to know about this stuff. They need to have access to it so that when they go about doing this, if they do, they need to go about it the right way. They need those freedoms, because research shows that when they need parental permission, they're not going to ask, and it means they're not going to get it. We shouldn't be opposed to contraception, okay? It's just it's a positive thing, right? Allows protection against STDs, protection against pregnancy, unwanted pregnancies, which ultimately should mean less abortions, less unwanted pregnancies, because they're not ready to have kids yet. Sex education from educators. US parents want up-to-date sex information for their adolescents. Most US educators want some of this to be taught in school, but not so much, right? And they want the information to be up-to-date, okay? But timing and content vary by nation, state, and community. When should they get the sex education? It depends, right? It depends on the country. In some countries, like in Finland, other places like that, they start very early. They start teaching kids about sex like when they're 7, 8 years old. In other places, like the US, it's when you're like in high school, 16, 17, guess what? It's too late, okay? It's not too late, but what I'm saying is you already know about it, and you already been misinformed about it, okay? It also varies by state. In some states, they say, hell no, you're not telling my kids anything about sex. That's my job. The problem is they don't do their job, and they don't really talk to their kids about sex either, right? We know the research. It varies on community, and the type of school, whether it's a public school or religious school or some other school, right? It all varies. There's a lot of disagreements about what we should teach and when and all that stuff, right? And research suggests that what is appropriate is that you teach them all that stuff about pregnancy, STDs, but also the other stuff, right? The psychological and the love and all that stuff. And you teach them early, before they even have those urges. Because by the time they have those urges, they're going to seek out information. It could be the wrong information. The HIV/AIDS crisis actually prompted sex education for most U.S. adolescents because of the whole AIDS crisis, which started in the early 80s, right? AIDS started being spread and people were dying. Okay, they didn't really have a treatment back then. It became very important to talk about sex and to educate people about this stuff. That's where the whole sex education in the US started, because of AIDS. And it's very important, right, that they learn about that. Current recommendations suggest that sex education should begin earlier. I would say before adolescence, right? Before they have those urges, before they get all that misinformation. But at least by the time they start adolescence, by the time they're in mid-adolescence, late adolescence, they already know a lot, okay? And it should contain a lot of practical information, how to protect themselves, how to use contraceptions, right? It shouldn't just be abstinence or male-female marriage. They also need to talk about homosexuality, right? And other types of relationships that some people, yes, are not going to be necessarily attracted to the opposite sex, right? It needs to be inclusive, all right? Those are the current recommendations. And it's a health issue, okay? Let's not pretend that it's something else. It is a health issue. And we need the right information, need the correct information, and we need to get to them early before they learn the wrong things, okay? Let's talk about mental health issues now. That was all about sex. Now let's talk about mental health issues. The adolescent years are very difficult years for people. It's a time when there's a lot of potential problems, okay? Teens can experience very intense and rapid changes in mood, okay? Because they're going through a lot of hormonal changes, which affect emotions directly and indirectly. This can lead to problems, right? These hormonal changes and these changes, extreme changes in mood, right? It can lead to internalizing and externalizing problems. We talked about these before. We talked about little kids because it also happens when you're younger. Internalizing problems are emotional problems that have to do with directing your emotions inward. When you inflict harm on yourself, right? You feel, because you internalize, so you feel sad, you feel depressed, you withdraw, right? You might even slash your wrist or attempt suicide. That's all internalizing. That's all have to do with basically focusing your emotions inward, right? It's more common in females. It can happen in both, but that's more common in females. Externalizing problems that's when you act out. Emotional problems are directed outward. So there's bursts of anger, right? You're more likely to injure other people, destroy property, defy authority, and go against the rules, do whatever you want. That's more common in males. A lot of it has to do with testosterone, right? But it's more common in males. It can also happen with females, but it's much more common in males. These are problems. And let's talk specifically about some of these problems like depression. Depression is actually very common in adolescence. And then it just to tell you a little bit about depression as how it varies throughout the lifespan. It's common in adolescence, and then it goes down like in your 30s and 40s, and then it rises again when you're older. And we'll talk about those things, how it rises again when you're older. So depression rates more than double after puberty. About 1 in 5 teenage girls, 1 in 10 teenage boys report being depressed. That's a lot of teenagers that are depressed. 20% of girls, 10% of boys. It's usually due to stress with school, with friends, problems with friends or peers, right? Sexual drives and urges, things like that. And the disconnect there between that and their experiences. They may have an identity crisis. They don't know who they are or where they fit in. They feel left out or whatever it is. They may feel that, that they're not cool or that they're a loser or something like that. And even genetic vulnerability. Some people are just more likely to be depressed than others. There is a genetic vulnerability, okay? Self-esteem drops at about age 12. Teens assess themselves more. They think more about themselves in relation to others, and a lot of them basically feel worse about themselves as a result. And that started earlier, by the way, but now it matters even more. And teenagers are even more likely to feel bad about themselves. Parents, teachers, coaches are more critical. As an adolescent, you're older, right? You look older. You look more like a grown-up. And they're going to treat you more like one. They're going to be mean. They're going to be harsh. They're not going to be as rewarding. And that's going to increase depression rates. You have to consider the fact that they're not yet adults. They're not yet grown-ups. So they still have a tendency to think like children in some ways, but they're treated like adults. Other emotional issues related to depression, there's also suicidal ideation. That's thinking about suicide. A lot of teenagers think about suicide. 37% of teen girls report feeling worthless, and 22% of them think about suicide, right? They think about it, okay? 20% of males feel worthless, and about 12% of them think about suicide. So it's actually very common. It's a very serious thing we need to actually consider. Parasuicide is a suicide attempt that doesn't result in death. You know, adolescents will often attempt suicide, but it's not, it doesn't result in death. That's called the parasuicide. Suicide attempts are actually more common in adolescents. A lot of adolescents actually do attempt suicide, but they're less likely to be successful at it. Suicide is less common actually in adolescence than adulthood. So adolescents attempt suicide more often, but they actually commit suicide less than adults. Because adults, when they try suicide less, but they're successful more often. Teenagers, they will try it more, but less often they will be successful. Or many times they weren't really serious about it and didn't really finish the job, so to speak. And they should not. Okay. Suicide is the third leading cause of death among teenagers. It's a very serious thing. Adolescent males are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than females. As a matter of fact, females are more likely to attempt suicide than males, but males are actually 5 times more likely to actually be successful at it. Why? Because of the way they do it. Males are more likely to use guns, knives, things that will actually finish the job, mostly guns. Females are more likely to try to use things like pills, slashing their wrists, things that often don't work, and they'll just get injured, right? So that's an interesting thing, that females try it more often, but males are 5 times more successful. Suicide warnings, there's a lot of them. They're depressed, their substance abuse is also a factor, an issue, right? Makes them more likely to commit suicide. Loss of interest in activities, when you see that teenagers don't really seem to enjoy much anymore and they don't really want to do the things that they used to enjoy, that might mean they're depressed, and then that might mean they're also suicidal. Withdrawal from family, from friends, right? That's not normal. Adolescents want to be around other people. Appetite changes, they don't feel like eating anymore, or they overeat, right? Morbid ideation, they have, they're thinking about death a lot, or they ask questions about death and murder and things like that. They start giving away their possessions, or they start talking about how they're going to be leaving and not coming back. All those are signs. Low self-esteem, when they go through a breakup, a relationship, right? You need to be aware of what your teens are doing, right? If they're in relationships, if they break up, right? You need to be there for them, and you need to comfort them, and, I'm getting a little emotional, but you comfort them, be there for them, right? You have to be aware of what they're doing. But when they break up, right, they're very moody, remember. They can get very bummed out and very depressed. And they should understand that that's a relationship, and that they're going to have others, and that these teenage relationships actually, aren't really that serious to begin with anyway. And they shouldn't, you need to advise them properly, okay? And tell them that, don't worry, you'll find somebody else. And, that person probably wasn't right for you anyway. And you need to be there for them. Homosexuality is also another risk factor, because those that are homosexual find less acceptance and they feel less normal, and they are more likely to be depressed. An abusive home, abusive parents, access to a firearm, that's a very serious thing, right? A lot of people in this country love their guns. You better keep those guns in a place where these teenagers can't get them, okay? Or these kids, all right? Low grades, they can be bummed out about that. Exposure to suicidal behavior of others, especially celebrities, right? You need to be connected with your teens. You need to know what they're aware of, and you need to be aware of these warnings. A lot about suicide here. Suicide also depends on many other factors. Some of the things we mentioned already. Availability of lethal means, especially guns. Guns are dangerous, okay? They are. No matter whether you're for guns or not, or whatever, gun control or not, they are very dangerous. They are there to kill people, and adolescents should not have access to them, okay? Be responsible if you're gonna have guns, okay? Lack of parental supervision, right? You're not watching your kids, okay? That's also a problem. You need to know what they're doing at all times. You need to know where they are. Use of alcohol and drugs, being males are more likely to commit suicide. Cultural attitudes. Some cultures they're more likely to accept suicide or believe in suicide than others. And we'll talk about those. It varies by ethnicity as well. Okay. Rates of suicide have actually fallen among adolescents since 1990. I should point out that nowadays, actually, they're on the rise because of opioids and other problems. Okay. You know, we have a messed up society now. Okay. And suicide is rising again. It went down to 1990. You know, 1990 it was falling, and then it's become a problem again. Okay. And it has a lot to do with drugs and a lot of the issues that we have in our society today that are just getting worse. The rate among African Americans has increased, the rate of suicide among African Americans, but it's still less common than European Americans. White people are more likely to commit suicide than Black people, right? Black people a lot less, but it has been rising among Black people as well, but it's nowhere near the rate of white people, of European Americans. Gender, ethnic, and national differences. Attempted suicide is higher for females, but suicide is higher for males, except in China, right, where it's more about equal. Okay, but you know, we talked about that already, how women are more likely to try it, be less successful at it. Males, when they try it, they're more likely to go through with it. Europe has the highest suicide rate. Think about that, right? What is that? That's white people, okay? They're the ones more likely to commit suicide. Hungary has the highest rate among nations. Hungary is a poor European country, okay? Africa and South America have the lowest rates. People of color are less likely to commit suicide. There are cultural differences there. It probably has something to do with the fact that, you know, people who are Black, people who are Latinos, you know, those kind of people, they're more used to hardship and poverty and having things be messed up. And we're used to it, we can cope with it. But those people who have it better, typically white people who are usually richer countries, when things are messed up for them, oh, they feel awful. Because compared to others, it seems like they're a lot worse off, right? As a white person, if you're poor and miserable and, you know, and you are not like the average, you're not doing as well as the average American, so to speak, you feel really awful. As a Black person, a Latino, well, we've been dealing with that for a long time. So we're more used to it. We're less likely to, you know, commit suicide because of something like that. Canada and the US are midway between these extremes, right? Suicide by ethnic groups, actually, American Indians, indigenous people are more likely to commit suicide. There might be some cultural things going on there, but also because if you think about the US, I mean, you know, the culture and the society of indigenous people, Native people, it's kind of been destroyed if you think about it. Think about what has happened to them, what this country did to them, right? And there's very few of them left. And the ones that are left, there's very few of them that are actually, you know, 100% indigenous. A lot of people that claim this ancestry actually have only a small percentage, right? But it's actually suicide's more common among them for very obvious reasons. It's really messed up what has happened to them. Then European Americans come after that. White people more likely to commit suicide, and then Latinos, then Blacks and Asians are the least likely to commit suicide, right? But if you exclude American Indians, which have a special situation going on, white people are just more likely to commit suicide than other people. It's what the research shows. Have some very high standards. White people have some very high standards as far as quality of life, as far as income and all those things. And when life is messed up, as it is for a lot of people nowadays, well, there's more depression, more opioid use, more suicide. And that's what's happening nowadays. It's bad, okay? Let's talk about other mental health issues like adolescent rebellion. A lot of adolescents will actually rebel during their teenage years, right? You're trying to raise them, you're their parents, you want to guide them, right? And sometimes they can rebel. They're more likely to rebel if you use authoritarian parenting. You know, that parenting where you're really mean and strict, right? And you're more likely to physically punish them and abuse them, right? After a while, they say, well, you know what? F you, right? I'm not taking this anymore. And that's what they say. And they say, you know what? Screw you. I'm going to do the exact opposite of what you want me to do. You don't want me to have sex? I'm going to have sex. You don't want me to use drugs? I'm going to use drugs, right? And they rebel, right? That authoritarian parenting can backfire. You want them to do things your way, right? So that they don't ruin their lives, and they can end up doing the exact opposite just to screw with you, right? When it comes to rebellion, breaking the law is the most dramatic example, right? Breaking the law. 44% of all serious crime, violence, arson is committed by those that are 10 to 20 years of age. A lot of it is committed by basically young adults, right? Teenagers as well, adolescents. Older people don't cause as many problems as young people. That's what it is for crime, okay? Arrests actually rise rapidly after age 12. Adolescent years, right? You know, you start getting into trouble. You're thinking differently now, right? Arrests rise rapidly after 12. By 16, it kind of peaks, and then after that, it declines. Because most people are not going to be criminals. They're not really going to be problematic. Most juveniles are not repeat offenders. A lot of them will break the law and cause problems, right? But 99% of them won't really go on to commit any other offenses. 99% of those arrested only commit one offense in their lives. So a lot of crime happens because of a very small percentage of people that commit crime over and over again. Most adolescents will only get into trouble once. They'll learn their lesson. All right, I'm done with this, right? Serious crimes are committed by many one-time offenders. A lot of serious crimes are committed by people who just, they messed up once, right? But most of them will not do it again. We'll talk about those that do in a moment. A lot of illegal acts like underage drinking, disorderly conduct, skipping school. When you talk about things like that, almost all adolescents are repeat offenders. Almost all adolescents will drink when they're underage, skip school, things like that. Even I did that, and I was a very good kid, okay? But I didn't do it a lot, by the way. I skipped school only a few times, and I did drink when I was underage. But when it comes to those kind of things, that you usually don't get caught, right? So you usually don't end up in jail. But the point is that most adolescents break the law. Most adolescents will do things that are illegal, but are not necessarily considered criminal, okay? Or something that you need to, it requires a lot of intervention or some serious therapy or something like that. More about breaking the law. The prevalence and incidence of criminal actions are higher during adolescence. During adolescence, yeah, are more likely to engage in criminal activity. 30% of African-American males and about 22% of European-American males are actually arrested once between age 18. About 30% of, almost 1 out of every 3 blacks will be arrested before they're 18, and about a little bit more than 1 out of every 5 white people are arrested before age 18. Now, keep in mind, though, that it is worse for African Americans. They're more likely to be targeted and more likely to be profiled. And if you're white and the cops pull you over, they're more likely to let you go with a warning and tell you to stop being stupid. If I catch you next time, I'm gonna bust your ass, but they let you go with a warning. If you're African American, they're more likely to bust you and not give you a chance. That's the reality we have in our society. We should not be blind to it, right? We see it everywhere. Most adolescents self-report breaking the law at least once before age 20. Most adolescents agree that they have broken the law at least once. Even I did that. I didn't do anything serious, right? But I did. I did engage in underage drinking. I did skip school, and that's against the law. I did, steal a couple of minor things, shoplifting, a candy bar, minor things, okay? Because I was encouraged by some friends. I actually had a friend who used to do that. And because of him, I did it a few times. Luckily, I didn't get caught, but this guy was habitual. This guy did it all the time. We actually bought things from him in high school. He would go and shoplift, and we'd buy the things off him. We'd get a huge discount. He would sell the stuff for like 25% or so of what it actually cost because he got it for free. Well, I actually went with him a few times, and I felt really bad, and I thought I was going to get caught, but I was just there, it was just something that happened, and I didn't really do it. There was this one time he was working at Round Table Pizza, and he talked to me about that. Every day after working there, he was the one who was entrusted with the money. He would take the bag of money, or it wasn't really a bag, but it would take the money and in a box probably or something like that, in some metal safe or something, and he would take it to the bank and deposit it. And it was like $5,000 every day. And he told me one day, "Hey man, why don't we steal it? I'll give it to you, and I'll tell the people at the pizza place that I was robbed, and I'll give them a description of someone who doesn't look like you." And we talked about it. Believe it or not, I was a good kid. We talked about it, right? And then he saw when he was talking to me about it that I was kind of shaking. I was scared, right? And he said, "Yeah, you know what? Let's not do this. Forget about it. Forget I mentioned this, right?" Yeah, that was this friend that I had, right? Yeah, I could have gotten into some bad stuff, right? Had we had gone through with that, I'm pretty sure we would have been caught. I'm pretty sure we would have been thrown in jail, right? And we were in high school. Luckily, nothing bad happened. But yeah, I did have a few bad influences, a lot of bad influences actually in high school. But I was mostly a good kid. But I almost, got caught up in some bad things. Luckily, I didn't. That didn't persist for me, as it is for most people. Most people are tempted here and there, and they don't really continue doing anything bad afterward. They get scared and say, you know what, no, I don't want to do that. That's wrong. Or, and then they don't continue. And if they do something bad and they get caught, usually that's it. They say, you know what, I learned my lesson. I'm not doing this anymore. Not this person, right? The friend that I had. He did clean up afterward, by the way. I mean, he became very devout and became a devout Christian and turned his life around. Never got into serious trouble, but he did do some things early on that were considered, pretty bad. Nothing where any violence or anything like that, but a lot of shoplifting. Okay. Other things about mental health issues, antisocial behavior is actually linked with ADHD. Remember we talked about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? That's actually linked to antisocial behavior, or basically antisocial behavior means behavior that is against other people, where they break the rules, they don't care about others, they hurt people without having remorse, things like that. That's antisocial behavior. There's two types of offenders when it comes to antisocial behavior. There's the adolescence limited offenders. There are those who they only cause problems, they only commit crimes when they're young. Their criminal activity stops by age 21. They were teenagers, they were young adults, they were acting stupid, they got into trouble. They grow out of it and then they stop doing that stuff. That's most people. Most people who commit crimes, that's, they're just limited to adolescence. And then there are those life course persistent offenders, that minority of people basically that continue to commit crime their whole lives. They have a recognizable childhood history. They have certain things in common. You could actually see that antisocial behavior in preschool and even elementary school, where they don't get along with others and they tend to get into more fights and argue more with people. They show signs of brain damage. They're slower to express ideas. They have poor emotional control, right? They're less likely to be able to control themselves. They tend to be hyperactive, more likely to have ADHD, right? They're the first to have sex, by the way, and they're the first to use drugs, right? They're the ones who are more likely to be considered to be cool, right? Doesn't mean that cool people are always going to be these criminals, okay? But they're the first ones to try those things, to go against the norm. They're the least involved with school. They don't care that much. They usually get bad grades, don't care. They prefer to hang out, right? Without intervention, they end up in prison or worse. They could end up dead. We see these patterns early on in children, and they need to be corrected, or you have a lifetime criminal on your hands. And it's not their fault. They have problems early on. There's problems with the brain. They process information differently. They can also have problems with parents. Problems at home, right? When you see signs that early, that there are several issues going on, and it's not the kid's fault that they have those tendencies. But if it's not corrected, they can become criminals, and these lifelong criminals. They need to learn right from wrong. They need to learn how to control themselves, all those things. Pathways to delinquency. Here's some troubling things that you need to know about. Those kids that you see that are more stubborn, right? That stubbornness that you see early on could lead to defiance later on, where they basically say, yeah, screw you, I'm gonna do whatever I want. And then could lead to running away, where they basically say, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm not following your damn rules, right? Those kind of adolescents, right? Response, what you should do with these kids, right? You need to provide social support, right? And you need to, and you also need to provide support that channels or limits that rebelliousness. They need an outlet for the rebelliousness, right? Sports or some other activity, but they'll show that stubbornness, that defiance, that, screw you kind of attitude, right? You need to channel that energy into something else. Shoplifting that you could see early on, right? In adolescence, if you don't correct that, that can lead later on to arson and burglary. They could move on to bigger things. Shoplifting starts with usually, little things, and then later on could turn into serious burglary, breaking into people's homes, stealing cars, or actually, even starting fires, burning people's houses down, starting a forest fire, burning cars down, right? You need to correct these problems early on. Response, right? Stronger human relationships, right? Again, teach them right from wrong, good parenting, all right, moral education, all that stuff. Easier said than done, of course. Bullying is a problem. It needs to be corrected. Bullying, if not corrected, later on could lead to assault, rape, and even murder if you don't correct this type of behavior early on in children. They're bullying. They want to do whatever the hell they want. They pick on people. Later on, they're more likely to assault people, beat people up, rob somebody at gunpoint, rape somebody, exert their will on somebody, basically, and even murder somebody. You need to correct this, okay? Response, action needs to be stopped in childhood. You need to stop this in childhood and correct it. Stop the bullying, right? Assistance in developing other ways to make connection. You need to teach them proper ways to relate to others, not bullying. There's some very troubling signs over here, and they need to be corrected, or you can end up with huge problems down the road. Let's talk about drugs. So drugs, yeah, drugs can be a big problem during adolescence, and even, of course, even beyond adolescence, but it starts in adolescence. Drug use and abuse, okay? So here's some terms for you guys you probably already know. What is drug abuse? Drug abuse is when you ingest a drug to the extent that it impairs biological and psychological well-being. You're abusing a drug if you're using it to the extent that it's causing you problems, biological, maybe it's causing problems with memory, or it's making you throw up, or it's making you get sick, or it's causing psychological problems where, you're not getting along with others, having problems with authority, problems at school, with relationships, right? You're abusing drugs when it's causing you those problems, okay? Drug addiction, when you're addicted, it means that you crave more and more of the drug to feel biologically and physically at ease. You need more and more of the drug to feel good. You develop tolerance, okay? And then you need more and more of the drug. You're addicted. That's what that means. Experiencing withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms is a sign of abuse, right? Withdrawal symptoms come in many forms, but you might feel restless, depressed, dizzy, any number of things. It depends on the drug. The withdrawal symptoms are usually the opposite of what the drug gives you. If the drug makes you feel relaxed, for instance, and happy, when you're not on the drug, you feel grouchy, you're irritable, you're restless, anxious, right? You're experience the opposite. And I didn't mention tolerance, but tolerance, of course, all that are signs that somebody is using and abusing drugs. And let's talk about these drugs. Tobacco, right? Smoking. It's a big problem, okay? The tobacco industry is a big problem. Tobacco is very, very harmful. Tobacco, which is found in cigarettes, decreases appetite. You're more likely to be putting cigarettes in your mouth than food, right? And reduces food consumption. So interferes with absorption of nutrients, okay? The habitual smoker, someone who smokes all the time, they're more likely to be shorter because they don't get the proper nutrients, right? More likely to be heavier as an adult if they start smoking early. More likely to be heavier. You might think that smoking keeps you thin. You're more likely to be heavier as an adult because, you are smoking, but you're also basically, deriving sort of pleasure through the mouth, as Freud would say. Your body adapts, right? Your metabolism slows down. And, you're more likely to be heavier. The health consequences, it damages the lungs, could get lung cancer, COPD, all sorts of diseases of the lung, damages the heart, the brain, the reproductive system. It actually causes a whole bunch of problems. Smoking in general is associated with dozens, if not hundreds, of health problems. It is that bad. It is awful. It is very toxic to the body. It will decrease your lifespan, okay? Increase your risk of cancer, heart disease, and stroke. You're more likely to die young if you smoke. And people usually start when they're adolescents. Some can start later, of course, but it's a very bad thing, okay? It will shorten your life if something else doesn't get you first, right? You will die of some form of cancer, most likely, and you will probably die 10, 20 years before you otherwise would have died, okay? I know it. I've seen it in my own family, okay? Nicotine, which is found in tobacco, right, in cigarettes, is actually one of the most addictive substances known. It's highly addicting. You might start out as a social smoker, just smoking for fun, you will soon get addicted. It is extremely addictive. Teenagers are quickly hooked. It comes in cigarettes, right? It's in cigars. We also have vaping nowadays, right? Where you're getting nicotine in that way. It's a different form of smoking, e-cigarettes. We'll mention that a little bit, how rates of that are going up. There's also alcohol. Alcohol is very popular, underage drinking. Even I did that, right? Alcohol is actually more harmful during adolescence than adulthood. Your brain is still developing. Alcohol loosens your inhibitions. It makes you more likely to do things you wouldn't do. It impairs your judgment. So you're more likely to have sex, right? More likely to abuse other drugs, more likely to do stupid things when you're under the influence of alcohol. That's what alcohol does. It makes you stupid. And can you imagine teenagers who already have difficulty controlling themselves, who are already impulsive, what alcohol does to them and what it can result in? Drinking during adolescence correlates with abnormal brain development, right? It impairs their memory, it impairs self-control, right? Damages the hippocampus, which is why memory suffers, and the prefrontal cortex, damages the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that allows you to think and plan and control yourself. Exposure to alcohol early on, especially heavy use of alcohol, is very harmful. Alcohol in general is just very bad at any age. Just so you know, alcohol is a poison. Okay, it is. It will also shorten your lifespan, especially if you become an alcoholic and you drink all the time. And yes, I've had family members who have died of cirrhosis of the liver. It leads to liver cancer. The more you drink, you're not going to get, liver cancer after, 1 year or after a few drinks, right? It builds up over time. You damage your liver and you might die in your 50s, your 60s, or who knows. I have my stepdad was an alcoholic. When he was younger, he stopped. He made it until 79, but still died of liver cancer. I have an uncle that he was a heavy alcoholic and he didn't stop. And he died at like 59 from cancer of the liver. It's a very bad thing. And by the way, you're not going to get a new liver, okay? If you're poor, you don't have good health care, or even if you're older, they're not wasting a new liver on you. They're going to give it to people who are younger, who have a better chance of living longer. And sadly, it's discrimination, but they're more likely to give it to people who have better health care, people who have more money. The rich people can always get their new liver. They will get ahead of the list one way or another. Okay, they have connections, but that's what happens. You drink alcohol. Okay, it will also shorten your life. Keep in mind that that's a very common drug. Even I will drink once in a while, but only occasionally, and only a couple of drinks. A couple of drinks are not that bad, not that harmful. On occasion, I might drink every 3 months or something like that. On a social occasion, I might have a couple of drinks, but hardly at all. But those of you who drink regularly, right, that's a problem. If you drink regularly, you might be an alcoholic. Marijuana used to be a lot more controversial, but marijuana does have effects, harmful effects. It slows your thinking, it does impair your memory, and it does reduce abstract reasoning. It does basically make it harder to do well in school. Very damaging during adolescence. Okay, academic learning requires better recall and abstract reasoning. Marijuana impairs those things. Okay, it impairs your ability to do well in school. It impairs your judgment. Okay, it's just it's another drug that kind of makes it harder for you to, act intelligently. A repeated marijuana user, someone who does it repeatedly, a habitual user, may also lack motivation and show indifference toward the future. Right? If you're really into marijuana, you're a big pothead, whatever you want to call it. You're really hooked on it, right? Use it all the time. It tends to make you not give a damn about anything. And you don't go anywhere. So you just want to do weed, and you're happy with that. Marijuana users usually take longer to graduate from college, longer to find employment, longer to get married. It's the kind of drug that makes you not give a damn so much, More likely to drop out of school, become teenage parent, more likely to be unemployed, right? But it is more popular nowadays. It's not as bad as we used to think that it was. Alcohol's worse. Smoking is worse than marijuana, but marijuana does affect people in negative ways. It is actually harmful, especially during adolescence, right? You don't want your kid to be a pothead, right? Or a habitual user of marijuana. If you only use it, every now and then, not that often, then it won't really do anything. But if you use it over and over again, if you're a habitual user, just like an alcoholic, you're a habitual weed user, those are the people who have problems. Variations in drug use, age trends, right? How does this vary with age? Adolescence is a time for experimentation. So, and that affects daily use and addiction. So here's the thing. Drug use increases from about age 10 to 25 and then tends to subside, probably because you get married and you have kids and you have to be more responsible. But when you're young, close to adolescence, to your mid-20s, you tend to act more irresponsibly and you're more likely to use drugs. Even I used to drink, right? I mean, we used to go to parties and every time we drank, we'd always drink to get drunk, but I didn't do it that much. I did it sometimes, not that much. I really wasn't my thing. I didn't get into it that much, but yeah, I did party. I did go to clubs. I did go to some bars and things like that. Not that much, right? I never got into smoking or weed or anything like that, but I did do a little bit of alcohol, not much. Use before age 15, use of drugs before age 15 is linked to escalation of negative behaviors and outcome. If you start doing drugs before you're 15 years old, that's a bad sign. You're going to have other problems down the road. There's cohort differences. Certain generations are more likely to use drugs than others. You know, remember the whole hippie generation? They were all into drugs, free love and free drugs, and it's all right, man, and all that stuff, right? They were really into that stuff. And then we got more conservative for a while, and now drugs are back, and they're more popular than ever. But there's some very important generational differences there, right? The older generations are nowadays less likely to be on drugs than the younger generations. But those older people, they had their time too when they were younger. A lot of them did that stuff too. I, for the most part, have been a good kid. I did experiment, just like most adolescents. But luckily, I never got into it that much, and I didn't really become a drug user. I didn't become addicted to alcohol or smoking or didn't try weed or anything like that. I was mostly a good kid. Inhalant use is most likely with younger adolescents. Younger adolescents are more likely to use inhalants, you know, and more likely to go sniff chemicals that they find in the, you know, and under the sink and things like that. Why? Because they don't necessarily have access to other things, so they're more likely to try things like that. It's a very troubling thing. Okay, there's less understanding of the risk, and there's graver consequences. You're more likely to be poisoned, damage your brain, sniffing some of those things. You know, doing some of those things. Cigarette smoking is down. The tobacco industry has been attacked a lot over the last several decades. We know they've been lying to us about the dangers of smoking. They've been covering it up, right? It's a lot more harmful than it actually is. By the way, just like with the fossil fuel industry now, the tobacco industry did that a long time ago. And now the fossil fuel industry is doing the same thing, trying to cover things up. But yeah, they've been attacked for a while. A lot of people have quit smoking. Cigarette sales are way down, but they found a way to make up for that. Now there's electronic cigarettes. Now there's vaping. Vaping is up, and especially among teenagers, because they have these cool flavors and colors and electronics, right? Electronic cigarette. And adolescents love electronic stuff. They love technology, right? Easy access. You can get the stuff over the internet. Often you don't even have to verify your age, or you just say, yeah, I'm an adult. Now give me this thing, right? That's the problem. Industries always find a way to adjust, just like the soda industry, which is actually the bottling companies. They also own the soft drinks, right? We found out that soda is really bad for us, so we consume it less now, but now we're drinking more juice, which is just as bad. Cigarettes really bad for us, right? We don't do it as much, consume it as much, but now vaping is up because that's the cooler thing now, right? They find a way around things. They find a way to adjust and continue selling you harmful products. Preventing drug use in general, you know, what do you need to do? Okay, so all psychoactive drugs are particularly harmful during adolescence. Drugs are very harmful during adolescence. It's a very sensitive time, okay? But adults who exaggerate the harm, right, or who abuse drugs themselves are unlikely to prevent their teen drug use, right? You're telling your kids not to drink, and you're an alcoholic. You drink all the time. Tell them not to smoke, and you smoke, right? Or you just exaggerate. Oh, it's gonna kill you when you're young, or it's just it's going to give you cancer when you're a teenager. No, it's not. Okay, it's not that. It's not like that. It'll cause problems down the road. But if you exaggerate, then they're more likely not to listen to you. Or if you're just a hypocrite and you use drugs yourself, right? You just hide it from your kids. Okay. Anti-drug problems can also cause a backlash, type of generational forgetting. Remember the thing about the DARE program? I went through all that in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid, the whole say no to drug thing, the whole campaign, right? They taught us about drugs and not to do them and things like that. It didn't work. A lot more people use drugs now. It did work for me. I stayed away from drugs. I didn't do them, okay? But for the most part, it backfired. We have more people using drugs than before. And a lot of it, by the way, was just a big scam, okay? They criminalized many drugs to punish people of color is what they did. They criminalized marijuana, you know, they punish crack users who are more likely to be poor and people of color than people who, let's say, used cocaine, which is more of the drug that the rich people use, right? That whole drug, the DARE program, that whole say no to drugs campaign was, I mean, supposedly it had a good message, but it did a lot of bad things. The reason for doing it, I mean, was really bad. They really, you know, and Nixon and other people have admitted this, that were in power. Well, Nixon even before that in the 70s, right? But they've admitted since then that it was meant to basically to punish people of color, to incarcerate a lot of people and throw them in jail, people they didn't like, black people, right? The whole, you know, program was a sham, okay? But things that do matter, that you can make a big difference, is price, right? Make something more expensive, people are less likely to buy it and use it, right? The price of cigarettes is going up. There's a lot of taxes on cigarettes. There's taxes on alcohol, right? The more expensive it is, the less people use it. Also perception, right? How do you view those drugs, right? Do you view them as cool, or do you think more about the health consequences? Parents are also influential. You can do a lot to teach your kids about drugs and prepare them for that so that they say no, right? And more likely, and if they do use them, to be responsible. But you need to be honest about it and not a hypocrite. That's it, you guys. I think I've said enough about that. I'll stop recording.